The order came through at 0340, and nobody questioned it, because nobody ever questioned Colonel Rynn Adler when his voice dropped that low. He had a way of issuing commands the way a surgeon cuts, clean, direct, no room for hesitation. The kind of man who made decisions before other men had finished asking the question. 14 years in the 75th Ranger Regiment had carved that certainty into him so deep it had become indistinguishable from instinct. When he said move, the ground moved. When he said hold, the air stopped. What he said at 0340, in the operations tent outside Kandahar, to 23 people who would carry it into the field 4 hours later, was this: "We're going in before first light. Single file, parallel to the ridge. Anyone who can't keep pace falls to the back and stays there." He looked at the assembled faces. Most were men he'd worked with for 2 deployments. Solid, tested, quiet, in the way that only people who've seen bad things get quiet. His eyes moved to the far left of the group, where Specialist Rynn Adler stood with her rifle slung forward and her notebook still open in her left hand. He didn't say anything about her. He didn't need to. Adler had been attached to the unit 6 days earlier, transferred from a long-range reconnaissance element that had been dissolved after a mission in Helmand that nobody talked about openly and everybody knew about anyway. She came with a single duffel bag, a Barrett Mimrad in a hard case, and a personnel file that Okafor's XO Captain Fen Hardcastle had described to him as thin in the wrong places. What that meant was this: she had high marks at the weapons school in Fort Benning. She had 1 confirmed engagement at 1,140 meters in conditions that the range officer had annotated as wind variable, target partially obscured, shooter elected not to use spotter. She had a citation that cited exceptional spatial reasoning under tactical pressure. And then there was a gap of 11 months that the file didn't explain, followed by a reassignment, followed by the transfer to them. Hardcastle thought the gap meant something bad. Adler, for her part, offered nothing to contradict him. She was 31 years old. She had brown hair she kept in a tight braid. She had a stillness about her that some people read as calm and others read as damage. And the difference between those 2 interpretations said more about the reader than it did about her. What Adler actually was, which nobody in the unit had yet figured out, was a person who conserved everything: words, movement, reaction, the way someone who grew up with scarce resources learns to conserve food. Not because she was afraid, because she had learned very early that the things you spend carelessly are the first things you run out of. The ridge they were moving toward was called Karwa by the local population and that damned shelf by the Rangers who tried to hold it twice before. It sat at an elevation of 2,300 meters, ran northeast to southwest for approximately 4 kilometers, and had 3 natural choke points that any halfway competent force would use to control movement through the valley below. The force they were moving against was more than halfway competent. The intelligence briefing, delivered by a tired-looking analyst named Corporal Jenks, who looked like he hadn't slept since sometime during the previous administration, indicated a well-organized insurgent network using the ridge as a staging point. They had 2 confirmed heavy machine gun positions, 1 rocket-propelled grenade team that had been repositioning every 48 hours to avoid pattern mapping, and what Jenks referred to as a coordinating element, meaning someone, somewhere on that ridge, was running their communications. "You take out the coordination," Jenks said, "and you've got a collection of guys with guns who don't know what the other guys with guns are doing. Still dangerous, not nearly as dangerous." Okafor had nodded. He understood the math of it. He'd been solving that particular equation for most of his adult life. What he hadn't told the group, what he'd told only Hardcastle quietly the night before, was that 2 previous attempts to neutralize the coordination element had failed. One team had been compromised before they got within range. The second had gotten into position and had the shot and had hesitated for reasons the after-action report described diplomatically as target confirmation issues. They weren't going to get a third failure. The window the ridge gave them was closing. By the end of the week, the network would have moved on, and 3 months of positioning work would dissolve into the landscape like water into sand. They moved out at 0430 in a column that stretched far enough that the front couldn't see the back. The terrain was punishing, loose shale that shifted under boots, steep grades that required hands as well as feet, cold that had teeth in it even in April. They moved without lights, which meant they moved slowly, which meant Okafor was calculating arrival time with a grim kind of arithmetic every 20 minutes. Adler was near the rear. She had asked for that position herself, which Hardcastle had taken as either professional humility or social avoidance, and either way didn't argue with. What she was actually doing was watching the ridge. She'd been watching it since the briefing, cross-referencing what Jenks had shown them with the terrain maps she'd pulled herself, running calculations in the back of her mind with the same automatic ease that other people use to maintain balance while walking. The ridge had a specific geometry. The coordination element, if it was doing its job, would be positioned somewhere with line of sight to both machine gun nests and the RPG team, which meant somewhere in the northern third, which meant elevation of approximately 2,450 meters, which meant a specific shadow profile at first light, which meant she'd already done the ballistic work by the time they were 40 minutes out from the objective. 1,260 meters. Elevated shooting position. Target approximately 12 meters higher than shooter. Wind from the northwest at an estimated 7 to 10 knots based on the movement of the dry brush she'd been watching since they left the staging area. Temperature drop overnight, which would affect both trajectory and the shooter's fine motor control. She didn't share this with anyone. Nobody had asked. They reached the primary observation post at 0611, 7 minutes behind Okafor's revised schedule. The sky was beginning to lighten in the way it does in that part of the world, not gradually, but in stages, like someone adjusting the contrast on a photograph. Okafor moved through the position, checking each element, speaking in the low, flat voice of a man conserving sound. He stopped briefly behind Adler, who had taken a prone position behind a natural rock formation and had her scope deployed before he'd finished his first pass. "What are you seeing?" he said. "Northern shelf. Approximately 400 meters right of the second gun nest. There's a depression in the rock face. Someone's been using it. You can see the disturbed surface on the approach path if the light's at the right angle." Okafor looked where she was indicating. He couldn't see it. "You sure?" "No," she said. "I'm working a 70% probability. I need another 12 minutes and better light." He moved on. He had other things to check. The 2 gun nests were confirmed. The RPG team had repositioned again as predicted, and Sergeant Dolan's element had eyes on the new position. Things were moving in the right direction, except for the central problem, which remained central. They knew where the pieces were, but they didn't know where the hand was that was moving them. At 0623, Adler said, "I have him." Not loudly, not urgently. The same way she said most things, which was the way you'd announce a weather observation. Hardcastle was the one who got to her first. "What are you looking at?" "Coordination element. He's using a radio. I can see the antenna configuration. It's a field-modified repeater setup. He's relaying between the 2 heavy positions." She didn't take her eye from the scope. "He also has a spotter. Younger. Positioned 6 meters to his left, using a monocular. You've got 2 targets. I've got 1 priority target. The spotter's irrelevant if the coordination element is down. The nests operate on a backup protocol. They'll use visual signals. Slower, less accurate. Gives your ground elements a window." Hardcastle looked at Okafor. Okafor had moved to a position just behind Adler's left shoulder. "What's the range?" Okafor said. 1,263 meters. The number landed in the observation post the way a stone lands in still water. The ripples were people shifting weight, people glancing at each other, people doing the math and arriving at the same answer. That was outside what most people in that position in those conditions would consider a realistic shot. There is a specific quality to the silence that follows a number like that. It isn't disbelief exactly. It's more like the silence of people recalibrating, updating the map of what's possible against what's being proposed. Okafor had been in enough situations to know that the silence after an impossible number either meant the number was wrong, or the person saying it had information that hadn't been distributed yet. He'd learned to treat both possibilities with equal seriousness. "Walk me through it," he said. Adler didn't move. "Elevated position, 12 meters above my current. I'm accounting for that. Wind is averaging 8 knots from the northwest. I've been tracking the brush and dust movement for 40 minutes. Consistent. Temperature is 31 degrees Fahrenheit at this elevation, which means I'm dealing with cold barrel conditions. I need one preliminary adjustment shot, but I don't have that option here. So you're shooting cold barrel at 1,263 meters in variable wind. Wind's not variable. It's consistent. I said variable earlier because I was still tracking. 8 knots, northwest, slight variance at the ridgeline where the rock channels it. I'm adding 2 minutes of angle for that. Hardcastle said, "That's still." "I know what it is," Adler said. She said it without any particular edge. She said it the way a mathematician might say it when someone points out that an equation is complicated, with the implicit understanding that complicated and impossible are not synonyms. Okafor crouched down so he was at eye level with her. She still didn't look at him. "Specialist Adler, if you take this shot and miss, we've given up our position. We have 23 people in a very bad place." "Yes, sir. If you don't take this shot, the window closes and we pull back." "Yes, sir. What's your confidence level?" She was quiet for 4 seconds. Not the quiet of someone who doesn't know the answer, the quiet of someone being honest about what an honest answer costs. 82%, she said. Nobody else in that position would have given a number. They would have said high or good or I've made harder shots. Adler gave a number because she'd actually done the calculation, broken it into its component probabilities, ballistic variables, her own physical condition, the target's movement pattern, the wind, and run it forward the way you run a model forward. And the model output was 82%, which meant an 18% chance of failure, which meant 23 people potentially compromised, which meant this was Okafor's decision, not hers. He stood up. He looked at the ridge. He looked at the sky, which was lightening further now, the window compressing on both ends. "Take your time," he said. "You tell me when you're ready." What Adler did in the next 11 minutes was not dramatic, at least not to look at. She made small adjustments. She breathed in a specific pattern. She had a method she'd developed over years that wasn't something she'd been taught formally. It was something she'd arrived at through iteration, the way mathematicians arrive at proofs, by eliminating what doesn't work until only what works remains. Her father had been an engineer. She'd grown up watching him approach problems structurally, not starting from the answer and working backward, but starting from the variables and following them forward without flinching from where they led. She'd applied that to shooting the way she'd applied it to everything else. As a system, not an art, which was why she gave percentages instead of assurances. Assurances were for people who needed comfort. Percentages were for people who needed accuracy. At 0641, the coordination element moved. Just slightly, stood up to stretch, sat back down. The kind of movement that tells you a person is comfortable, settled, not expecting anything. Adler had been waiting for exactly that. She exhaled halfway. The rifle did what she'd calculated it would do. Okafor heard the shot, and then he heard nothing for about 2 seconds, and then Hardcastle said, "Target down." 3 words. Clean. The radio came alive immediately after. The 2 gun nests attempting to raise the coordination element, getting nothing, switching to the backup visual protocol, which was exactly what Adler had said would happen. The ground elements had a window. They used it. The detail of what happened in the 47 minutes following that shot is something that belongs to the after-action report and to the people who lived it and to the kind of institutional memory that military units carry forward through deployments. What belongs to this account is the simpler thing. It worked, not because it was supposed to, because someone had done the arithmetic and trusted the arithmetic, and then executed with a kind of steadiness that can only come from having spent years training yourself to be something other than afraid of the number. Afterward, when they were back at the staging area and the debrief was in progress, someone asked Okafor who had taken the shot. He pointed to the far end of the room, where Adler was sitting alone with her notebook open, writing something that might have been notes or might have been calculations. From a distance, in her handwriting, they were hard to tell apart. "Her," he said. The person asking, a general's aide who'd been observing the operation, looked at Adler for a moment, then looked back at Okafor. "The specialist?" "The specialist," Okafor said. He said it without emphasis. He didn't need to. 2 days later, Adler was called into a meeting with the general's aide, a JAG officer, and someone from the intelligence side whose function was never clearly stated. They asked her to walk through the shot. She did. They asked her to explain her confidence assessment. She did. They asked her about the 11-month gap in her file. She told them what had happened in Helmand, the mission she couldn't discuss in open settings, the shot she'd been tasked with that she hadn't taken because the data hadn't supported it, because the confidence level had been 61%, and she'd assessed that as insufficient and she'd held fire, and the target had moved and the mission had failed. And 11 months of review had concluded that her decision had been correct, but outcomes matter more than process, and so she'd been reassigned. The JAG officer made a note. The intelligence person asked, and this time you assessed it at 82%. What changed? Adler thought about it. The wind was cleaner, she said, and I had more time to track it. That was the whole answer. There wasn't a more satisfying one available. The difference between the mission that ended her previous assignment and the mission that restarted her career was 7 knots of wind consistency and 11 additional minutes of observation time. Mathematics doesn't know what's at stake. It only knows what's true. Hardcastle found her after the meeting, outside the operations building, looking at the mountains. They're putting you in for a commendation, he said. Okay, she said. He waited for something more. That's it? Okay? She glanced at him. Something in her expression shifted just slightly. Not warmth exactly, but the kind of acknowledgement that passes between people who've been through something together. What do you want me to say, Captain? I don't know. Most people, after something like that. He stopped. Started again. I had you wrong, Adler. I want to say that directly. She looked back at the mountains. You had a reasonable read on incomplete information, she said. That's not wrong. That's just incomplete. He thought about that for a while. The gap in your file, he said. Helmand, that's what they buried you for. Holding fire when the math didn't support it, yes. And then they commended you here for pulling the trigger when it did. Yes. The system's not exactly consistent. No, she said, it's not. She closed her notebook. But the math is. She picked up her rifle case and walked back toward the barracks, and Hardcastle stood there for a moment watching her go, and then looked at the mountains himself and thought about the difference between a system that measures outcomes and a mind that measures truth, and how rarely those two things agree with each other, and how much it costs the people who insist on the difference. The commendation was filed, the after-action report was filed, the mission was declared a success, which it was, by every measurable standard. Adler's name appeared in 3 places in the official documentation: the roster, the commendation, and a single line in the summary that read long-range engagement executed at 1,263 meters, target confirmed. No breakdown of the calculation, no mention of the 11 minutes of wind observation, no record of the number she'd given, 82%, or what it had cost to say it honestly, rather than rounding it up to something easier to hear. That information existed only in her notebook, in the neat small handwriting that looked like math, because it was math, and in the memory of 23 people who had been on that ridge and had heard the shot and had understood. In the way that people understand things, they'll never fully be able to explain that something specific and unrepeatable had happened. The mountain didn't care. The wind had already changed. But the shot was exactly where she'd calculated it would be.